Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the help. So I'll try. I think we are. Yeah. Let me start my timing. Okay. So thanks for the presentations. I'll try to somehow shift your focus from into more scientific theories and stuff like that. So the main topic that I'll be presenting today is the idea that are we best justified in being naive realists, given the no-miracles argument. So before I jump into my topic, I will try to explain a couple of stuff. So first of all, the no-miracle argument is one of the core or main arguments for realism or scientific realism. So they use the no-miracle argument to support the idea that the success of scientific theories in science somehow give us evidence or support that they're true. And this argument has two forms, as suggested by Barnes. One of them is the miraculous theory argument, which is the idea that individual scientific theories, their success would be an indicator of their truth. And the other one is the idea that this theory choice that the scientific community makes based on which theory is successful or not is based on their truthness. So I'll only be dealing with the first version of the no-miracles argument. And a couple of other definitions before I jump into my topic. So the main idea, like naive realism, and we have many forms of realism. One of them is naive realism, other ones are structural realism, entity realism, and the other ones. So what differentiates naive realism from approaches such as what we can title selective realist approaches is that naive realism has a holistic commitment to the theoretical posits of a theory. So if, for example, a scientific theory is composed of laws, entities, structures, explanations, and whatever, a naive realist would basically say that everything that a scientific theory posits is true. While the other selective approaches, they are also realists, but in the sense that they are not necessarily committing themselves into all of the into saying that all of the posits are true. For example, a structural realist would say that only the structure of the scientific theory is true. An entity realist would say only the entities are true. And an explanation realist would say that only the posits that take part in explaining a certain phenomena that a scientific theory tries to explain are true. Otherwise, any other thing committed by them, we would not be justified into believing in them. So my analysis would be an epistemological analysis into the topic. So it would be in terms of trying to argue whether we have justified belief or not. So I'll not really be dealing with the other forms of like trying to approach this issue being metaphysical or semantical. It would be an epistemological. Yeah, I'll be referring to the miraculous theory argument, as I mentioned, which is only focusing on individual scientific theories. So the aim is basically to analyze naive realism and through the no-miracle argument. So we take the no-miracle argument as an argument, given that the no-miracle argument is true, would we be best justified into being naive realists or not? So the first part of the topic would be analyzing the ways we could have a no-miracle argument and how through the no-miracle argument we would be justified in naive realism. And the second part would be to look at what I titled truth indicators. And I'll try to mention that in that part, what they are and what they're supposed to be, and try to see whether we would be best justified in naive realism through them as well. So yeah, it's basically focused on naive realism compared to the other approaches that we have for realism. Okay, so the first part, the formal analysis of the numerical argument. So as you might know, the numerical argument, because it says like it tries to tie or it tries to connect the success of scientific theories and the truthiness of scientific theories, we cannot have a deductive version of it, because somehow our premise would be if scientific theory A is true, then scientific theory A is successful. But the only empirical evidence that is available for us is scientific theory A being successful. So we can somehow say theory A is successful, but due to, for example, theories being committed to non-observable entities and blah, 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 stuff like that, we cannot necessarily count for the truth. So our main evidence for them would be to say, to go from the success part back into whether they're true or not. And this would be a fallacious nature. Or basically we're committing the affirming consequence fallacy. So if theory A is true, then theory A is successful. If theory A is successful, we cannot say therefore theory A is true. That argument commits the affirming the consequent fallacy. So we cannot go back from the consequent into the antecedent, because it can be another reason for why scientific theory A is successful rather than true. For example, an anti-realist might say, well, it might not be true, but it might not be that the things are true, but rather they are practical, or they work somehow. So we cannot have a deductive version of a numerical argument. So what other version can we possibly have? What is the nature of the numerical argument? So what if we try to say, okay, suppose that we neglect the deductive version and we have a numerical argument in which through it we somehow bring the explanations for why a scientific theory is successful, basically naive realism, entity realism, blah, 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 blah. And we put a threshold into explaining the success, and any explanation that goes beyond the threshold would be acceptable. So for example, if you say a scientific theory is successful, and entity realists say it's because the entities are true, and he somehow can provide a way to explain that phenomena. That would be an acceptable explanation, while another approach that doesn't give us explanation for why this is the case would be excluded. But this creates a problem, because given that we have this form of inference, we could have more than one explanation for why a scientific theory is true. And among them, we could it only gives us a way to disclude the explanations that are not possible, but it doesn't give us a way to try to choose between the explanations that are possible. So for example, say we have a list of possible explanations why scientific theory is true, but we don't have a way of saying, okay, which explanation among these one that we have is actually the one that is we are best justified in believing them. And the second problem it creates is that it creates what we title in logic the problem of irrelevant conjunction. So I think I have them in this second slide. Yeah, okay. Okay, so I mentioned the first part. Okay, what is the problem of irrelevant conjunctions? So given that, for example, we have a set of evidence, if I say H explains this set of evidence, and we somehow probabilistically have evidence, we know that H supports that evidence, I could come up with another theory saying that H and A also explain the evidence, but the conditional that A is an irrelevant part with respect to E, meaning that A would neither increase, E would neither increase the probability of A or decrease the probability of A or whatever. Let's say H and A are also are both explaining E, and that would also be as equally valid as our first commitment, A being the A and B in the second part being the relevant conjunctions here. And probabilistically, we don't have a way of trying to cut out these irrelevant conjunctions. So let me try to give an illustration of this in usual daily terms that we might encounter. in science. So for example, if I have a theory, say Newtonian theory of gravity. So Newtonian theory of gravity says, for example, the reason that we have gravity is because gravity is a force. And his explanation is like mathematically and explanatorily is enough to account for all the evidence that we have. And then we also have another theory which says, so we have another theory which says, oh, gravity is a force, but at the same time we have some entities which we could call monkey patas or anything else, which also are there, but they do not take part in the explanation whatsoever, and they like us implying them would not necessarily change anything, neither about the evidence nor anything else. So probabilistically speaking, we don't have like we would not have any problem with having any amount of these forms of irrelevant conjunctions or these forms of irrelevant entities, whatever, if we add to a proposition, and they would still all be valid. So the problem it creates for us is that we could basically formulate an infinite amount of explanations with an infinite amount of irrelevant conjunctions or irrelevant parts to say that this explains the phenomena that we have, which is basically successive scientific theories. And we don't want that to happen. So we would need a version of the numerical argument which somehow provides us a way of trying to first differentiate between which possible explanations is better justified or not. And second, in case of if we have irrelevant conjunctions, it could basically cut it out. So and this is the best formulation of the numericals argument, which is the inference to the simplest explanation. And it is the used version of the numerical argument within the philosophy of science literature, which basically says that the numerical argument is an argument that is not deductive, but rather it's an inference to the best or inference to the simplest explanation. This meaning that it uses epistemological razors to cut any unnecessary part which doesn't take place, which doesn't take place in the explanatory aim that we have. And also it gives us a way of choosing between the possible explanations that we have, meaning that the list that I mentioned previously. Among the list that there are possible explanations, we have a way of choosing between them. And that is by saying that the one simpler would be the best among them, and that would explain the phenomena that we have. And why is this the case? And this is the crucial point. I'm using epistemological razors, not metaphysical razors. So, for example, I'm not saying that my appeal to simplicity means that the nature out there is simpler, but rather I'm saying that we appeal to simplicity because that's otherwise the other forms that are available would be basically other forms of irrelevant conjunctions. So we basically use an ISE version of the numerical argument. So, and now this is the main question that I'm trying to address in part one. Would we be best justified in being naive realism given that we have a version of the numerical argument which is an ISE version, inference to the simplest explanation? Okay. So given that there are like we said, we have more than one possible realistic approaches for explaining the success of science. If we take one of them, for example, structural realism would imply only the existence of structures to explain the success, and it is successful in doing so. If we ask an entity realist would say, okay, what only exists are entities, and he would be basically successful in explaining, for example, the history of science by only appealing to why entities have never changed. Or a structural realist would say why structures have never changed, or we would be justified in believing in structures. But when it comes to naive realism, due to its holistic commitment for entities, structures, laws, and blah, 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 or anything like inside there. So it basically says that all of these things exist. But if we look at the versions of structural realism and entity realism compared to naive realism, they could basically do the same thing, which is basically to explain what we have given least amount of commitments, and they are successful in doing so. And given that we have these forms of realism, it basically implies that what we have in structural realism might be somehow a form of irrelevant conjunctions. Therefore, we either need to use epistemological razors to cut out the unnecessary parts that are not taking part into the explanation, which then would deviate us from what naive realism is, which is the idea that everything about the scientific theory would be necessary for explanatory purposes, or that we need to somehow leave naive realism. So basically, the conclusion that I have here is that our appeal to an ISE version of the numerical argument would basically make us less justified in the numerical, like being naive realists would mean that we are not best justified in believing in the numerical arguments, but rather there are other better approaches. So, okay, in part two, I'm trying to also analyze the numerical argument, but this time I'm focusing on the word success. What do we exactly mean by the success of scientific theories? So a scientific theory is successful in terms of doing what? So what is the measure of the success of scientific theory? And since the numerical argument implies that this success is a truth indicator, I'm titling this aspect that measures the success of the scientific theory as a truth indicator. So for example, some say that a fruitfulness of a theory is a measure of success of the theory. Some say the novel success, another empirical success, other simplicity, whatever. So I'm terming these aspects as truth indicators. This is what I mean by truth indicators. So for example, if a scientific theory is fruitful, does it mean that it's true or not? Or given that we take this as a truth indicator, given that we take truthfulness as a fruitfulness as a truth indicator, would we be best justified in being naive realists or not? So I'll only be focusing on two of them here, empirical success and novel success. Okay, what is basically empirical success? So for a theory to be empirically successful, it needs to account or explain all the evidence that we have and make general predictions within the domain of evidence available. And what do I mean by that? It means that if you have a set of data, you need a theory that explains why the data behaves so, and also try to, within the range of the data or within the, it might be also extrapolated, but without bringing in other data, it can make predictions. So somehow if we say, why do metals expand? You have a theory that would say metals expand because of blah, blah, blah. And it can also make a prediction for the next metal that's saying that the next metal would expand as well. So there are general predictions, they're not novel predictions or whatever. So this is empirically success. So a scientific theory is empirically successful if it can do this, if it has these two properties. So the problem here is that we have a problem if we have this empirically success as a measure of truth, and that is called under the determination of theory by evidence. So what is this, and how does it relate? How is it related to our issue here? So under determination here is that if we have not enough evidence, so if we have a set of evidence which is not enough, we might have two scientific theories that would account for the set of evidence equally. Right, so if you have not enough evidence to determine between the two challenging scientific theories, which one of them is better, according to empirically successful theories, both of them would be correct, right? So, and now this is an issue for realism, and specifically for naive realism. So for the purpose of explanation, I will try to explain it this way. Imagine that we have these two theories, T1 and T2. T1 is implying that P, Q, and R exist, and T2 is implying that R, S, T exist. So these are different theoretical posits apart from the R, which is present in both theories. So a structural realist would say, okay, because we have R in both theories, then that means we're justified in believing in R because they're selective, and it says that R is structure. So there are structures that are similar in both cases, so we could be justified in believing that R exists. An entity realist would say that R can be entities, which are the same entities in this theory and that scientific theory as well. And apart from the entities, we might not be justified in believing in the other posits, but we could be believing in the entities. But the issue for naive realism is that naive realism takes all of the posits of a scientific theory to be true. So in the case of this one, a naive realist would not say that we can only be justified in R, for example. You say that in T1, you have to believe that P exists, Q exists, and R exists. And T2, a naive realistic approach would be to say that R, S, and T all exist. And this is the issue. So we basically have two scientific theories implying the existence of two sets of different things. And we don't have enough evidence yet to determine which one of them is better. So according to empirical equivalence success, they're both successful. But a naive realist would be inconsistent to believe that both T1 and T2 are true at the same time. So while the other approaches of realism can basically successfully solve this problem, naive realism doesn't. I know I'm a bit out of time, but I have a couple of more slides if it's possible to finish it. It's not
carry on for the couple of slides. Sure.
So, okay, so that is for empirical success. But the naive realist can say, okay, but empirically successful theories doesn't necessarily mean that they're true. We might have another theory for another truth indicator, which is novel success. So it might say, well, what is novel success? So it says that a scientific theory is novelly successful if it makes novel predictions, which is unaccounted for by the evidence that we have. So, for example, a very common example here is that the Einstein's prediction of the bending of light. So, if it wasn't for the theory of relativity, which Einstein proposed, we could not have been able to find out that the light was bending. So in this case, we are not trying to build up a theory to account for the evidence that we have, but rather we have a theory that predicts a certain event, and we would not be able to predict the event without the help of the theory that we have. And the event would become somehow a part of the evidence for the theory itself later when we discover it. If it's true, if it's not, then that's another thing. But that is that is what novel prediction is. So basically, a scientific theory needs to be novelly successful. But the issue here is that we have an issue which is called pessimistic meta-induction theory idea. So this idea is basically that we have, in the history of science, we have many many scientific theories which were novelly successful. So basically they made novel predictions, like Fresnel's theory of light, the Phlogisteinian theory in chemistry, but we don't consider them to be true now. So basically we could say that novel success doesn't necessarily mean that a theory is true, but and the best response that I've read so far for trying to solve the problem of pessimistic meta-induction is structural realism. It says somehow that, so even though the France's theory of light was novelly successful, we don't believe in it now, but somehow Francel's theory of light, the structures within them, and many of the mathematical equations are currently present within the theory that later succeeded the Francel's theory of light. So even though all of the things within the theory changed, but the structure still is preserved. And when basically scientific theories change, structures are still preserved within the theory. So structural realists can somehow solve this pessimistic meta-induction by saying that not necessarily when scientific change happens, everything is gone. But naive realism cannot address this issue, because when scientific theory changes, at least some parts of it change, even though the change is not a revolutionary one. So, for example, even in the Newtonian theory of mechanics, the Newtonian theory of mechanics when Newton wrote the Principia is different from the Newtonian theory of mechanics that was used in the 1800s, which was basically have been altered, and there were many things that was replaced and many things that was added later on for the purposes of accuracy, and some things that was not right, it was basically fixed. So basically what I'm trying to say is that changes happen within the scientific theories all the time. But a naive realist cannot account for this change, while a structural realist can do that. A naive realist would be committed into believing that everything about the scientific theory exists. So when something in the scientific theory changed, they don't have a way to justify why this changed and justify why, like, they believe that the scientific theory was true. So when something changed about it, they cannot answer why this thing happened if the scientific theory is true. So so basically what I'm trying to say is that we would not be best justified still in believing in naive realism, given we take novel predictions as truth indicators. So that is my two main conclusions. So I tried to show how, given that we have an ISE version of the numerical argument, we would be least justified in believing in naive realism, at least not best justified. And I also tried to address in the second part how it fails to address the problem of underdetermination and the problem of pessimistic meta-induction. Yeah, so that was my presentation. Sorry for taking a lot of your time. Thank you.
Thank you.